You want to leave? Go ahead. Walk out that door. See how far a nobody like you gets. The words landed the way they always did, not with a shout, but with a smile. Charles McNally had learned long ago that a smile could cut deeper than screaming. It left no bruises anyone could photograph. Tina stood at the kitchen sink, her hands buried in water that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She didn't turn around. She already knew the expression on his face, that particular curl of the lip he wore when he knew she had nowhere to go, no one to call, and nothing to her name that he hadn't already claimed. She kept scrubbing. Mondays, he dismantled her with silence, refusing to speak for hours until she apologized for things she hadn't done. Tuesdays, he checked her phone, scrolled through every message, read every search, demanded explanations for grocery runs and grocery receipts. Wednesdays, he controlled the heat, the locks, the light, literally, if he felt like it. By the weekend, he'd perfected a face so warm and so giving for Sunday service that the women in the fourth pew still whispered what a good man Charles McNally was. A good man. The neighbors on Birchwood Lane saw the Charles who held doors, shoveled elderly Mrs. Patterson's driveway in January, and never raised his voice in public. They did not see the man who now stood behind his wife at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night, rolling an empty beer bottle across the granite countertop like a slow, deliberate threat. They didn't see what 3 years inside a beautiful house with this man had done to the woman who used to laugh too loud, take solo road trips, and once, a long time ago, knew exactly who she was. That woman felt like someone else's memory now. Tonight, though, tonight had a different weight to it. The air in the house had changed around dinner, when Tina had made a mistake so unforgivable she was still trying to understand it. She had answered a question about her father. Just answered it. A neighbor had asked about the framed photograph by the front door, Officer Michael Sullivan, Decorated Patrol Division, City of Philadelphia, and Tina had smiled. Just smiled. And said, "He was the bravest man I ever knew." Charles had waited until the neighbor left. He hadn't thrown anything. Hadn't screamed. He'd just stood in the hallway for a very long time, and then he'd said, quietly, "Your father couldn't even keep himself alive." What does that make you? Tina's grip tightened on the edge of the sink. Her left hand slipped into the front pocket of her cardigan, the pocket Charles never checked because he didn't know about this cardigan, or about the phone folded inside it. A second phone. Prepaid. 11 contacts deleted. 1 remaining. She had typed the message 4 days ago and stared at it every night since. "I think I'm ready. I need your help." She had never sent it. Charles's footsteps moved closer. The bottle rolled again. Not yet, some voice inside her had kept whispering. Wait. Make sure. Because she had seen what happened to women who tried and failed. She had been that woman once, 2 years ago, when she'd packed a bag and made it as far as the end of the driveway before Charles had stepped onto the porch in his bare feet, calm as anything, and said, "If you get in that car, I make 1 phone call and your little secret goes everywhere." She had come back inside. But that was before she found the documents hidden in the filing cabinet behind his winter coats. Before she knew what he had stolen. Before she understood the full scope of what he had done, not just to her body, not just to her sense of self, but to the last thing her father had ever given her. She hit send. The message disappeared into the dark. Delivered. Tina stood perfectly still. Charles had moved to the living room. She could hear the TV, the volume turned up too loud, the way it always was when he was building towards something. She had 40 minutes, maybe less. She moved to the basement door. She had packed the bags 6 weeks ago. 17 minutes later, a pair of headlights swept across the living room wall like a slow, cold tide. A black car. No markings. Tinted windows. It pulled into the driveway with the kind of unhurried certainty that belonged to people who had never once in their lives been told to hurry up or stay quiet or make themselves smaller. Charles was on his feet before the engine cut. "Who the hell is that?" Tina stepped out of the hallway, bag in her hand. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years, and something in her chest unlocked like a deadbolt finally turning the right way. This is it. Outside, a car door opened. A man in a black suit stepped onto the wet driveway. Rain beaded on his shoulders. He didn't look at the house right away. He just stood there for a moment, still and unhurried, like a man who had made peace with every difficult thing he'd ever had to do, and had decided, long ago, that some things were worth doing anyway. When he finally looked up, his eyes found Tina through the porch light like he already knew exactly where she'd be standing. And he extended his hand. Everything Charles McNally thought he owned was about to be repossessed. But to understand why a man like Fabio Romano was standing in the rain on Birchwood Lane at 9:47 on a Wednesday night, you have to go back 15 years. Back to a cold Philadelphia morning, a car that wasn't supposed to explode, and an off-duty cop who had absolutely no reason to run toward the fire. Except that he did. Because that's who Michael Sullivan was. And Tina was his daughter. There is a particular kind of cruelty that never leaves marks where anyone can see them. Charles McNally had mastered it the way other men master a trade, through repetition, refinement, and a complete absence of remorse. Monday, he threw the coffee mug at 7:14 a.m. Not at her, exactly. Near her. That was his preferred precision, close enough to make her flinch, far enough to maintain deniability. The ceramic exploded against the backsplash 2 inches from Tina's ear because the eggs had gone lukewarm while he read the paper. He didn't raise his voice. He simply set down the newspaper, picked up the mug, and let it go. Then he stepped over the shards on his way out the door. Tina swept them up before she'd even stopped shaking. Tuesday was the audit. He went through her phone the way a customs officer goes through luggage, methodically, without expression, looking for something he hadn't decided on yet. Passwords. Location history. The timestamps on her text messages. He checked the mileage on her car against the errands she'd claimed to run. When the numbers didn't add up to his satisfaction, he took the car keys and put them in his jacket pocket. "You can ask me when you need to go somewhere," he said. "That way I know where you actually are." Wednesday brought $40 and a list. Groceries for a week, for 2 people, in a city where inflation had been quietly devastating the middle class for 2 years. When she came home $11 over budget, he didn't shout. He laid the receipt on the kitchen table, smoothed it flat with his palm, and explained, slowly and carefully, that she was irresponsible with money and that this was exactly why he couldn't trust her with the joint account. Thursday, she slept on the couch. She had stopped asking why. Friday was the performance. Charles transformed on the drive to church the way the sky transforms before a storm, abruptly, completely, without warning. By the time they reached the parking lot, he had his arm around her shoulders and a warm hello ready for every person they passed. Pastor Hendricks shook his hand. The women in the fourth pew told Tina she looked tired and suggested she let her husband take better care of her. She smiled and said she was fine. She was always fine on Fridays. Saturday was the day he destroyed her mother's photo album. He said he was looking for the stapler. He said it was an accident. But Tina had watched his face when he dropped it, watched him watch the photographs scatter across the floor, and she saw something there that wasn't regret. She gathered the photos on her hands and knees. Some of them had torn. Her mother at 26, laughing on a New Jersey boardwalk. Her father in dress blues at the academy graduation. Tina at age 7, sitting on his shoulders like she was the tallest person in the world. She pressed the torn edges together and said nothing. Sunday was when everything changed. Charles had left his office unlocked. Whether by carelessness or exhaustion, the filing cabinet behind his winter coat sat open, one drawer ajar. Tina had gone in to return a stapler, real, this time, and had stopped when she saw the folder labeled Sullivan Estate/Final. She opened it. Then she sat down on the floor of his office for a very long time. Offshore account statements. Her father's will, forged, the signature slightly wrong in the way only a daughter would notice. A letter from a financial institution she'd never heard of, addressed to Charles, confirming a transfer of $400,000 in 2021. The year she married him. The year he told her her father had left her nothing. She sat there until her legs stopped trembling. Then she stood up, replaced the folder exactly as she'd found it, and walked quietly back to the kitchen. What Charles did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never once in 3 years considered her capable of strategy, was that Tina had been documenting everything for 8 months. A second phone, prepaid, kept in a cardigan pocket. Audio recordings of the worst nights. Photographs of the bruises she'd catalogued in the bathroom mirror before they faded. Copied bank statements. Screenshots of his emails. A growing, meticulous archive of a man destroying a woman from the inside out, filed neatly on a USB drive tucked inside a hollowed-out cookbook on the kitchen shelf. She had been waiting for the right moment. She now had her reason. The prison on Maple Street had one weakness: the man who built it never imagined his prisoner was already picking the lock. There were two kinds of powerful men in Philadelphia. The kind who needed people to know it, who wore their authority like a costume, loud and visible, desperate to be read correctly from across a room. And the kind who didn't need anything from anyone, whose power lived so deep inside them it had become indistinguishable from the way they breathed. Fabio Romano was the second kind. At 39, he occupied the corner office of a downtown import firm the way a king occupies a throne, not with performance, but with complete and settled certainty. His suits were Italian. His silences were long. The men who worked for him had learned, over the years, that the moments to be most careful were not when he raised his voice. It was when he went very, very still. Tonight he was still. On the mahogany desk in front of him sat a manila folder, a glass of water he hadn't touched, and a photograph of a woman standing outside a Philadelphia grocery store in a gray cardigan, her arms crossed against the cold, her eyes cast slightly downward in the particular way of someone who had learned to make themselves small in public spaces. He had looked at that photograph every day for 2 weeks. He had been looking for her, in one way or another, for 15 years. The car bombing had been meant for his uncle. Fabio had been 24, still learning the architecture of the family's world, still carrying the recklessness of a young man who believed consequences were something that happened to other people. He'd been in the wrong car, on the wrong block, at the wrong hour, and when the device detonated, the world had compressed into heat and pressure and the particular silence that follows catastrophe. He remembered almost nothing of the next few minutes. What he remembered, what had stayed with him with the clarity of something branded, was a pair of hands. Strong hands, reaching through the driver's window while the frame was still hot. A voice, steady and unhurried, "I've got you. Don't fight me. I've got you." Officer Michael Sullivan had pulled him free 11 seconds before the fuel tank went. The blast threw them both. Sullivan absorbed most of it. He spent 4 days in intensive care, developed complications the doctors said were related to the internal trauma, and died on a Tuesday morning in March with his daughter, 19 years old, sitting in a hospital chair, holding his hand. Fabio had attended the funeral from a distance. Dark coat, dark glasses, standing at the back of the crowd like a man who understood he had no right to grieve publicly for something that was, in the most essential way, his fault. He had made a promise over that grave. He had spent 15 years failing to keep it. 2 weeks ago, Rosa Martinez had been buying tomatoes. Her brother Marco worked Fabio's security rotation, and Rosa, sharp-eyed, loyal by proximity, had recognized the woman in the cereal aisle from an old photograph Marco kept in his wallet. A photograph Fabio had distributed quietly, years ago, to people he trusted. "If you ever see her, call me." Rosa had called Marco. Marco had called Fabio. Within 48 hours, Fabio's team had built a complete picture of Tina Sullivan McNally's life. It had taken less time than he'd hoped and was worse than he'd feared. The abuse was systematic, documented in the patterns his investigator recognized immediately: a woman who flinched at sudden movements, who spoke in careful, measured sentences in public, who had no financial independence, no close friends left, no visible exit. And then there was Charles. The insurance adjuster had been sloppy in exactly the way that small, arrogant men are always sloppy, convinced that no one was watching closely enough to connect the threads. But Fabio's tech team had connected them in under a week. Fraudulent claims, processed through McNally's firm, routed to 3 separate criminal organizations. Ghost policies. Phantom payouts. A man laundering other people's dirty money through a spreadsheet and a Sunday school smile. Fabio had picked up the phone and called Agent Reyes. "I have something for you," he'd said. "And I need something in return." Some transactions were cleaner than others. This one, he could live with. He was still studying the photograph when his phone lit up on the desk. A message. The prepaid number he'd given Marco to pass along quietly, carefully, through a chain of 3 trusted people, to a woman in a gray cardigan who he prayed had enough left in her to use it. "I'm ready. Please help me." Fabio looked at the message for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood, smoothed the front of his jacket, and walked to the door of his office where his driver, Sal, was already waiting with his coat. "We're going to Maple Street." Sal nodded and said nothing. That was what Fabio valued most about him. As they rode the elevator down to the garage, Fabio looked at his own reflection in the brushed steel doors, the tailored suit, the neck tattoo creeping above the collar, the face of a man who had learned, the hard way, that every debt left unpaid eventually collects itself. "Michael Sullivan saved my life. Tonight, I return the favor." The word sat beneath the message like a quiet detonation. Tina stared at it for 3 full seconds, then locked the phone, slid it back into her cardigan pocket and turned off the kitchen faucet. Her hands were shaking, but her mind, strangely, had gone calm. The particular calm of someone who has just stepped off a ledge and realized that falling, at least, is simpler than standing still. From the living room, the television roared. A commercial. Then Charles's voice, aimed at no one, "Turn this garbage off." Then silence. Then the crack of another bottle being opened. She had maybe 20 minutes. She moved without rushing. Rushing would make noise, and noise would bring him to the doorway, down the hall, past the basement door, down the stairs in her socks, one hand trailing the wall in the dark because she'd learned months ago that the light switch clicked too loud. The bag was where she'd left it, behind the water heater, inside a cardboard box labeled winter linens in Charles's handwriting from when they'd moved in. He had packed that box. He had labeled it. He had never once opened it since. She pulled it out and set it on the concrete floor. Inside the bag, 2 changes of clothes, her father's badge, the one Charles didn't know she still had, her social security card, $314 in small bills she'd been skimming from the grocery money for 11 months, and a photograph of her father at her college graduation, laughing, his arm around her shoulders like he could hold the whole world back if he had to. She zipped the bag and went back upstairs. The cookbook was on the middle shelf, between a slow cooker manual and a spiral-bound church fundraiser recipe collection from 2019. Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Julia Child. Tina had never once cooked from it. She'd bought it at a thrift store specifically because Charles had no interest in it, because a man who checked her phone and her mileage and her grocery receipts had never once looked at the bookshelf. She pulled it down, opened the hollowed center, and closed her hand around the USB drive. 8 months of her life on a piece of plastic smaller than her thumb. She tucked it into her bra, put the book back, and straightened it on the shelf until it looked undisturbed. The television went quiet. She heard him stand. Tina. She was already in the hallway when he appeared in the living room doorway, backlit by the muted screen, beer in hand, his eyes doing the slow inventory they always did, scanning her face, her hands, her posture, looking for evidence of something he hadn't decided on yet. "Who were you texting?" "No one." She kept her voice even, familiar, the careful neutral tone she'd spent 3 years perfecting. "Phone's dead. I was just turning off the faucet." He looked at her for a long moment. She held completely still and thought about her father. "What would you do, Dad?" The answer came the way it always did when she let herself hear it, not in words, exactly, but in the memory of a man who had run toward a burning car while everyone else ran away. A man who had told her, once, sitting on the front steps of their old row house in the blue summer dark, "Tina, the only thing fear is good for is telling you where the courage needs to go." "I'd fight back," she thought. He'd fight back. Charles took a step toward her. And then the headlights came. They swept slow and wide across the living room windows, the unhurried arc of a large vehicle making a deliberate turn into the driveway, high beams cutting through the evening dark like a verdict being read aloud. Charles stopped. He turned toward the window, then back to her, and something shifted in his face, a fracture in the performance, a hairline crack in the man who had spent 3 years convincing both of them that he was untouchable. "Who the hell is that?" Tina reached down and picked up her bag. The movement was so quiet, so deliberate, that for a moment Charles didn't register what it meant. By the time he did, she had already straightened to her full height, and something in her eyes, something he had never seen before and didn't have a name for, made him take one small, involuntary step backward. She walked past him toward the front door. The cavalry didn't always wear badges. Sometimes it wore Italian suits and drove German cars. The Mercedes came to a stop with the unhurried precision of a full stop at the end of a sentence. The engine cut. For a moment, nothing moved, just the rain beginning to beat on the windshield, the porch light casting its narrow yellow square across the wet driveway, and the particular held-breath quality of a situation that has crossed the threshold from bad to irreversible. Then the driver's door opened, and Matteo stepped out first, large, silent, taking his position beside the rear panel with the practiced ease of a man who had stood in a lot of driveways and never once been the most dangerous thing in them. Then the rear door opened, and Fabio Romano stepped into the rain. He didn't look up immediately. He straightened his jacket. Adjusted one cuff. Then he raised his eyes to the house on Maple Street with the calm, assessing expression of a man taking inventory of something he'd already decided what to do with. Charles was on the porch in under 10 seconds. "Can I help you?" The performance was impressive, Tina thought from the hallway shadows. She could hear it even through the screen door. The voice of a man who coached Little League and shook the pastor's hand, deployed now like a weapon, indignant, territorial, righteously confused. The voice of someone who had never once been called on his behavior by anyone who had the standing to make it matter. Fabio looked at him the way a man looks at weather. "Tina McNally is leaving with me tonight." A beat of silence. Then Charles laughed, a short, sharp sound, more reflex than amusement. "Like hell she is." He spread his hands wide, gripping the porch railing on one side, the post on the other, physically barricading the entrance the way he'd barricaded everything else. "This is my wife. This is my house. I don't know who you think you are, but I'm asking you to get off my property before I call the police." Fabio didn't move. Not an inch. Not a shift of weight. "You have two choices, Charles." His voice was conversational, almost quiet, which somehow made it worse. "You let her walk out that door tonight. Or I make one phone call, and federal agents are on this street in 4 minutes. I've already cleared the timing with them. They're nearby." The word federal landed like something thrown. Charles's face changed, the performance flickering, the mask developing a crack directly down the center. What are you talking about?" Fabio reached into his jacket and produced a manila folder. He walked it to the base of the porch steps and held it up without extending it further, making Charles come down to retrieve it, a small choreography of power that Charles didn't seem to notice until he was already on the bottom step. He opened the folder. His hands were steady for the first 6 seconds. Then they weren't. Photographs, Charles in a parking garage, shaking hands with a man whose name appeared in 3 active federal indictments. Bank statements with account numbers in institutions that didn't advertise domestically. A memo, 2 pages, single-spaced, summarizing 14 months of fraudulent insurance claims, processed through McNally Adjustments LLC, routed outward through channels that required a very particular kind of cooperation from the man whose name was on the letterhead. Charles flipped through the pages the way a man reads a diagnosis he's been dreading. The screen door opened. Tina stepped onto the porch. She had the bag in her left hand and her chin level and her eyes clear, clearer than they'd been in 3 years, maybe clearer than they'd been since the morning she'd sat in a hospital corridor and watched the number on her father's monitor go flat. Charles looked up from the folder. "You." The word came out like something tearing. "You did this. You betrayed me. After everything you went to him. I know about the money, Charles. Her voice didn't waver. Didn't climb. It arrived the way Fabio's had, quiet, and therefore impossible to dismiss. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the fraud. I know about my father's will. She paused. I know everything. Something in his face collapsed and rebuilt itself as rage. He lunged. Matteo was faster. He was simply there, between Charles and the porch steps, one hand planted flat against Charles's chest, immovable as a wall, his expression carrying the mild professionalism of a man performing a routine task. Charles pushed against him and got nowhere. Fabio's voice came from the driveway, unhurried. Touch her, and you'll have bigger problems than the FBI. And that was the moment Charles McNally ran out of road. Because there was no one left to perform for. No neighbors watching from behind curtain shears. No pastor to vouch for his character. No softball team who thought he was a stand-up guy. There was only a wet driveway, and a man in a tailored suit who was not afraid of him, had never been afraid of him, and had the particular stillness of someone who had faced genuinely dangerous things in his life and found Charles McNally to be a very minor entry on that list. The folder fell from Charles's hands. Pages scattered across the wet porch. He didn't pick them up. He stood there in his own doorway, in his own house, on his own street, and did absolutely nothing. Because for the first time in 3 years, possibly for the first time in his life, there were consequences standing in his driveway that he hadn't been able to see coming, and he had no script for this, no leverage to reach for, no version of himself that worked in a world where someone simply wasn't afraid. The monster on Maple Street discovered he was just a man, and a coward at that. Get whatever evidence you have. Fabio's voice came from the base of the porch steps, calm and absolute. We're leaving in 5 minutes. Tina turned and walked back into the house. Charles followed her. Of course he did. Because the performance outside had failed, and now he needed a smaller stage, somewhere without witnesses, without a man in a tailored suit watching from the driveway with the patience of someone who had already decided how this ended. He needed 4 walls and a closed door and the version of Tina he had spent 3 years carefully building, the one who flinched, who softened, who gave him one more chance because she had nowhere else to go. Tina. His voice had changed completely. The rage was gone, packed away with the same efficiency he used to pack away everything inconvenient about himself. What replaced it was warmth, practiced, immediate, almost convincing. Baby, listen to me. We can work this out. Whatever you think you know, whatever he told you, I can explain it. I'll change. I want to change. You know that. She kept walking. Kitchen. Middle shelf. Please. The word came out soft, almost broken, and once, not long ago, in the early months when she still believed the version of him he showed the world, it would have stopped her cold. Don't do this. Not like this. Not with him out there. Come on. Look at me. Look at me, Tina. She reached up and pulled the cookbook from the shelf. Mastering the Art of French Cooking. Julia Child. She had never cooked a single recipe from it. What are you? Charles stopped. What is that? She opened the cover. Lifted the hollowed block of pages. Closed her hand around a USB drive resting in the carved-out center and held it up so he could see it clearly in the kitchen light. She turned to face him. And something happened that she hadn't expected. She saw him. Really saw him, maybe for the first time, not the man who had terrified her, not the monster she had lain awake calculating how to escape, not the towering force she had organized her entire survival around. Just a man in a gray t-shirt standing in his own kitchen, his face going pale, his hands slightly open at his sides. Small. Ordinary. Afraid. Pathetic. This, she said, is 8 months of your abuse. Audio recordings, 31 separate incidents. Photographs of every bruise you left that I documented before it faded. She kept her voice level, methodical, the same careful tone she'd used to survive every week that had led to this one. Copies of my father's real will, and the forged version you substituted. Bank statements for 3 offshore accounts you opened in 2021. Records of 14 months of fraudulent insurance claims processed through your firm and routed to 2 criminal organizations. She paused. Communications between you and the people you processed them for. Everything, Charles. Copies of everything. Dated, labeled, and backed up in 3 separate locations that you cannot access. The color left his face in stages, like water draining from a tub. You've been spying on me. The words came out hoarse, stripped of everything except disbelief. For 8 months you've been. No. She lowered her hand, closed her fingers around the drive. I've been protecting myself. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. There's a difference. She walked past him to the doorway where Fabio had appeared, silent, punctual, his 5 minutes apparently elapsed. She held out the drive without ceremony, and he took it and passed it to Matteo without looking down. Then she turned back. Charles was still standing by the kitchen shelf, next to the gap where the cookbook had been, and he looked, for the first time in 3 years, in possibly the only moment of honesty their marriage had ever produced, exactly like what he was. My father was a hero. Her voice didn't shake. Didn't climb. It arrived with the same steady weight she'd heard in Michael Sullivan's voice every time he told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was knowing that some things mattered more than being afraid. He ran into burning buildings. He pulled strangers from wreckage. He gave his life for someone he had never met, because that's what it meant to him to be a man. She looked at Charles the way you look at something small and broken that you are done trying to fix. You hit women. You steal from the dead. You forge the signatures of men who were worth 10 of you, and you spend their money pretending to be something you're not. The last sentence she delivered quietly, almost gently, because it didn't need volume to land. I hope prison teaches you what real fear feels like. She picked up her bag and turned for the door. Charles grabbed her arm. It was the last decision he made as a free man. Matteo's hand closed over his wrist before the grip could tighten, a single, efficient motion, no wasted movement. Charles's arm redirected with a force that wasn't brutal but was absolute. Charles stumbled back against the counter, knocking the cookbook stand off the edge, and it hit the floor with a crack that rang through the kitchen like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Fabio Romano stepped through the doorway. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move quickly. He simply stood in the entrance of Charles McNally's kitchen and looked at the man with the particular expression of someone who has commanded genuinely dangerous people in genuinely dangerous rooms and found this to be the least complicated situation he'd encountered all week. When he spoke, it was almost quiet. She's coming with me. This is the last time you'll ever touch her. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Tina was sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment, a clean, quiet place in a building with a doorman and a security panel and locks that only she had the codes to, when her phone lit up with an alert she had been waiting for and dreading simultaneously, the way you wait for the results of a test you already know the answer to but aren't ready to have confirmed in writing. Philadelphia man arrested on 16 federal counts, Charles McNally, local insurance adjuster. She turned on the television. There he was. The man who had monitored her mileage and controlled the thermostat and thrown a coffee mug 2 inches from her head on a Monday morning because his eggs had gone lukewarm. He was coming down the front steps of their house on Maple Street in handcuffs, flanked by 2 federal agents, his face carrying the stunned, contracted expression of someone experiencing consequences for the very first time. 16 counts. Insurance fraud. Forgery. Embezzlement. Domestic violence. The crawler at the bottom of the screen ran his name in clean block letters while his neighbors stood on their lawns and watched. His pastor. His softball team. The women from the 4th pew who had told Tina she looked tired and suggested she let her husband take better care of her. They stood in the gray morning light with their arms folded and their faces arranged in the particular expression of people confronting the distance between what they believed about someone and what had been true all along. Tina turned off the television. She sat in the quiet for a while. Then she made coffee, and she drank it slowly, and she let herself feel, not triumph, not relief exactly, but something older and simpler than either, the particular stillness of a weight being set down after you've carried it so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. Fabio came that afternoon. He knocked, 3 times, even, spaced, and waited in the hallway until she opened the door, which she understood was intentional. Everything about how he moved through her space was intentional. He sat in the chair across the room rather than the couch. He accepted coffee and held the mug with both hands and didn't speak until she was settled. Then he set an envelope on the table between them. "This is yours," he said. "It's been yours since 2019. The accounts have been located, the funds recovered, and the legal transfer is complete." He paused. $400,000. Your father's life insurance policy and pension, exactly as he left it. Tina looked at the envelope for a long moment without touching it. Then something in her chest came apart, not violently, not with the jagged quality of the grief she'd carried for years, but the way a knot comes apart when the tension finally releases, slowly, and then all at once. The tears arrived before she'd made any decision to cry, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at the ceiling the way her father had always told her to when she was small and trying not to cry in public. "Look up," he'd say. "Give them somewhere to go." "He really did leave me something," she said. It came out barely above a whisper. "He left you considerably more than money." Fabio set down his coffee. 15 years ago, your father pulled me out of a burning car. I was 24. The device was meant for my uncle. Michael Sullivan had no reason to run toward that wreckage, no jurisdiction, no backup, no obligation except the kind of man like him couldn't turn off. He said it plainly, without theater, the way you relay a fact that has lived inside you long enough to have lost its edges. He didn't survive the injuries. I spent 15 years trying to find his daughter to repay what couldn't be repaid. And then 2 weeks ago, Rosa Martinez bought tomatoes. Tina looked at him. Your father gave me a future, Fabio said. The least I could do was give you yours back. The room held that for a moment. Then Tina wiped her face with the back of her wrist and straightened in her chair, a gesture so familiar it might have been inherited, the precise way a decorated Philadelphia officer had straightened in photographs and doorways and hospital corridors when he decided he was done being broken by something. "What happens now?" she asked. "Charles will take a plea deal. The FBI case is ironclad. Between your recordings and the fraud documentation, his attorney will advise him to cooperate. 12 years, likely. The insurance ring is being dismantled. My involvement has been," Fabio turned his coffee mug once on the table, "quietly recognized by the people it needed to be recognized by. That chapter is closing." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm not asking about Charles. Or about any of that." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his voice carrying the same unhurried weight it always did, except now it was aimed at something other than authority or consequence. "What do you want to happen, Tina?" She blinked. 3 years. 3 years of a man who monitored every movement, controlled every dollar, interrogated every expression, and not once, not in all of it, had anyone sat across from her and asked her what she wanted. The question arrived like light through a window she'd forgotten existed. She thought about the women she'd read about during those 8 months of careful documentation. The forums she'd found at 2 a.m. on the prepaid phone. The testimonies posted anonymously by women who used words she recognized from the inside. She thought about what it had cost her to find the thread back to herself, and how much harder it would have been without a number to text, without someone on the other end who answered. "I want to help other women," she said. It came out clearly, without hesitation, as if the answer had been waiting and only needed the question to open the door. "I want to use what I know, what I went through, so that someone else doesn't have to stay as long as I did. Doesn't have to feel as trapped." She paused. "I want to make sure there's always someone who picks up." Fabio nodded once. "Then we'll make that happen." The life she never expected wasn't about luxury or romance, it was about freedom, purpose, and rediscovering the strong woman her father raised. 6 months later, Philadelphia had moved on the way cities always do, without ceremony, without pause, folding one chapter into the next with the indifferent momentum of a place that has seen too much to be surprised by any of it. Tina Sullivan, she had gone back to her father's name the week Charles entered his plea, sat at a corner table in a downtown cafe with a courtier going cold beside her and a manila folder open across her knees. Case notes. A woman in West Philadelphia, 2 children under 5, a husband who had recently escalated from financial control to physical threats. The shelter had intake paperwork. The legal aid attorney needed a timeline. Tina was building it, carefully, methodically, the same way she had once built her own, so that when this woman was ready to move, everything would already be in place. She had learned that the most important thing you could give a woman in that situation wasn't a speech about courage. It was a plan. She closed the folder, finished her courtier, and pulled on her coat. Outside, Philadelphia was doing what it did in late autumn, gray sky, wind off the Delaware, the particular quality of light that made the city look like a photograph of itself. She walked the 3 blocks to the courthouse the long way, past the park where her father used to take her on Sunday mornings when she was small, past the memorial wall where his name was still engraved in the stone with the rest of them. She touched it briefly as she passed. The way she always did. Charles McNally had taken his plea deal in September. 12 years, federal prison. The sentencing hearing had lasted 40 minutes. His attorney had called him a man of previously good standing in his community, which had produced an audible sound from the gallery, not quite laughter, not quite outrage, something in between, the sound of people who had attended his church and watched his little league games recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a man they had trusted. The colleagues, the pastor, the softball team. They had all watched the evening news with the same expression Tina had seen on her neighbor's face the morning of the arrest, that particular collapse of a belief held too long without examination. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt something quieter, the sense of a thing being correctly resolved. Of a scale finally, after a long time, finding its level. She met Fabio for lunch occasionally. A place on Chestnut Street, corner booth, a standing arrangement that neither of them had formally proposed but both of them kept. Their conversation ranged in the easy, unhurried way of two people who have no performance to maintain with each other, her work, his, the city, her father's foundation, which had begun its first grant cycle in October and had already funded emergency relocation for 11 women in 3 counties. He never asked for anything. He never referenced what he had done as a favor or a sacrifice or a gift. When she had tried, once, to find the language to thank him properly, he had looked out the window at the street below and said simply, "The debt is paid." And the way he said it, with such complete and settled finality, made it clear that the subject, as far as he was concerned, was closed. His cooperation with the FBI had helped dismantle 3 major fraud operations. His own legal complications had been, as he predicted, quietly resolved by people who found his cooperation worth considerably more than his prosecution. Philadelphia being Philadelphia, nobody asked too many questions about the arithmetic. She stopped in front of the courthouse on her way back. The stone steps where Charles had stood in handcuffs. The door through which he had walked in a free man and walked out something else. She stood there for a moment in the wind, her coat pulled close, her folder tucked under her arm, and she let herself think about her father the way she could now, without the weight of grief pressing the memory flat, without the shadow of a man who had stolen his name and his money and his daughter's sense of her own worth. She thought about what he'd taught her. That the most dangerous thing you can do, sometimes, is nothing. That courage isn't the absence of fear. She had been terrified every single day of those 8 months, terrified when she hit send, terrified on the porch with her bag in her hand, but that fear and action are not, in fact, mutually exclusive. That you can shake and move at the same time. That her father had known this better than anyone, because he had spent his entire career running toward the thing everyone else was running away from. And she thought about a rainy driveway on Maple Street. A black car. A man in a tailored suit who had extended his hand and waited, not with impatience, not with performance, just with the simple, steady offer of it, and how the world had divided itself, cleanly and permanently, into before that moment and after. Justice, she had learned, did not always arrive with sirens and ceremony. Sometimes it came quietly, in the dark, after you'd stopped believing it was coming at all. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen, the shelter's main line. She answered on the second ring. Tina. The intake coordinator's voice was careful, measured. We have a woman. She's ready to move tonight, but she needs someone to walk her through the steps. She's scared. She keeps saying she doesn't think she can do it. Tina was already walking. Tell her she can, she said. Tell her I'm on my way. She passed the memorial wall one more time, her father's name catching the light the way it always did, and she spoke to him the way she had learned to, not with grief, but with the particular intimacy of someone continuing a conversation that had never really stopped. Dad. You saved a life 15 years ago. That life gave me mine back. Now I'm paying it forward. This is what you taught me, we protect the ones who can't protect themselves yet. The work continues. She turned up her collar against the wind and walked on. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives in a black Mercedes at dusk, wearing a tailored suit, and simply says, "She's coming with me." And sometimes, years later, it shows up as a strong woman helping another survivor find her way home. Thanks for watching till the very end. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be dropping another unforgettable story tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss it.